right, welcome everyone, and welcome to Collective Intellectualities. I'm Amy.
And I'm Alex, and today we have Liz Jackson, who is a professor of international education at the University of Hong Kong. And Liz has authored numerous publications, including 3 recent books: Contesting Education and Identity in Hong Kong, Beyond Virtue, The Politics of Educating Emotions, and Questioning Allegiance, Resituating Civic Education, which also received the American Educational Studies Critics' Choice Book Award in 2020. Liz is also the immediate past president of the Philosophy of Education Society of Australasia. So we're very excited to have you here with us, and thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
So Liz, we wanted to begin with a kind of general question about educational philosophy and what it means to be a philosopher of education. And you identify yourself as a philosopher of education. So what does it mean to work as a philosopher of education today in this historical context? And also, how do you approach your research as a philosopher of education?
That's a great question. And so I do identify as a philosopher of education very strongly. And I think, but I don't know if this is something you're aware of, but actually a lot of people do contest what is a good philosopher of education, as well as what role philosophers of education should be playing in societal debates today. So I was trained in the field of philosophy of education, and I understand it as a field where you apply philosophical ideas to educational issues. So for many of us, we focus on the assumptions behind educational problems, as well as what are the overall goals of education and how do we achieve those goals or not achieve those goals in the case there's a mismatch. So I think a lot of people in society say, like, education should do this, education should help the economy, or education should help young people face challenges in the real world. So those are some views that people have, and there's some assumptions underneath those views of the right kind of education to achieve those goals. What we normally find is a mismatch between what we think education should be doing and what it actually is doing. And this is where I think everyone secretly has a philosophy of education, but not everyone identifies as a philosopher of education. When it comes to the way I approach research, some philosophers of education actually don't engage with what we might call in social sciences, for most education researchers, human data. So a lot of people don't gather data from humans. So I normally don't gather data from people in the way that it's normally understood in educational research. But I'm mostly grappling with different arguments. However, some philosophers of education just compare philosophies and just analyze philosophies very deeply. In my work, I've always tried to have a strong connection to empirical understandings and empirical arguments. So in my work, what I usually do is I look at current social debates and trace them out in terms of educational debates. So I do study policy texts. I usually study textbooks and curriculum documents. So if we're discussing schools should help young people to have good mental and emotional well-being, is that in the curriculum? How is it described in the curriculum? Is there one sentence about that and then 20 sentences about helping the economy? So I view that as a reflection of society, which is a little bit different than doing an interview or questionnaire, coding data, doing surveys, something like that. And then I think sort of at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is making a moral argument about what should schools do. So a lot of educational research is focused more on, is an intervention working in terms of certain criteria for what works? So if we do X in the classroom, then Y happens afterwards, and sort of studying the relationship between the two. Or just simply in grounded research, exploring a certain community's experiences in detail. So to put it very simply, I think most educational researchers focus on what is actually happening and what's going on in a certain context. Whereas for me, I'm interested in what should be going on, which is a totally different question, and it requires different resources, which are philosophical, and I would argue as well as empirical, because once we have an idea what should go on, we should think about how does that relate to what we're actually doing.
And I like how you put where you're concerned with the moral arguments of education. I think this really aligns too with a lot of your recent work about how you describe civic education as a process of learning how to live together. How does this differ from traditional approaches? And then could you also expand on what education as learning to live together means?
Yes, thank you for that. So this is something I've been thinking about for a long time, is civic and moral education. And one thing that has been enormously helpful for my understanding of civic and moral education is to work and live in different countries. So in the United States, there's not really a focus on moral education. It's known as like a controversial issue because it's related to religious education, the separation of church and state. Moral issues are seen as quite controversial compared to discussing politics per se. When I got to Hong Kong, it was actually the flip of that. And what is non-controversial is discussing morality and being a good person in society, whereas discussing civics and politics is becoming increasingly taboo in this context. Something else I was thinking about a lot as I was conceptualizing education for learning to live together is I think that a lot about what we learn about learning to live together in schools is under the surface and something that we might call a hidden curriculum. It's something, so if I ask you, what did you learn about being a good person and living with other people in society in schools, or what did you learn in civic education? You might say, I didn't learn anything. But what I like to do is look beneath the surface. Okay, we do have certain understandings which we hold about how to treat other people in the world, how to treat our neighbors, how to treat our family and friends, how to treat people in our society, people who are similar to us, people who seem to be different from us, and how to treat people all around the world. So all of us do have an attitude about that. And we've learned that attitude from a variety of sources. One of those sources is schools. Schools is charged with something which we describe across countries as civic education, citizenship education, something like this. But I want to argue that a lot of that content is not just in one subject, because most societies don't actually have a subject of civic education per se, but people learn about it through a variety of experiences in education. So they learn about it from history education, they learn about it from geography. Maybe when you're learning a second language, you learn some messages about how to treat diversity in your country or internationally, and just the attitudes of people around you. And media is a big part of that too now. So for me, learning to live together, focusing on that makes me discover a lot more than I would discover about this process if I was only focusing on the traditional curriculum. So most people who might study civic education across cultures might look at, okay, what is the subject in England? What is the subject in Hong Kong? So in England, it's X, and in Hong Kong, it's Y. But then you're actually going to have a hard time comparing the two. In fact, in all societies, we do learn how to connect with people around the world, but we do that across curriculum. So I tried to really sort of flip the script. So in order to then start thinking about it systematically, because this is just so broad, I want to touch on everything here, but it is too broad and nobody knows about everything happening in the world. So in order to try to make it systematic, I created my own framework, which is learning to live together in concentric circles of human connection. So starting with family and locale. So in kindergarten, everyone learns about their neighborhood, explain about your family, explain about your school community. Then eventually you learn about your nation state, your country. You might learn also about your local region or sort of the larger region. So in Hong Kong, of course, you're going to learn about Hong Kong. You might also learn about Western civilization, Asian civilization, being an African, something like that, being part of the European Union. And then you have the global community. So with that framework in mind, I think, how are people learning about these different levels of relation and how to connect with people across those levels of relation through education? And then that enables me to say, look, this is happening everywhere, because a lot of people will say, oh, we're lacking a moral education curriculum in the United States, or we're lacking a civic education curriculum in Hong Kong. But from this perspective, we can then dig down beneath the surface and see how there is education about living together and connecting with people, but that education is just not a subject like learning to live in the nation state. That subject doesn't exist, but there are many lessons you can draw if you look at diverse sources in the school experience.
So kind of linking the first question and the second question together, this question of moral education and moral argumentation in your work is an interesting one. And I wonder how you handle, first of all, perhaps how you define morality and how that definition then how it informs your philosophical argumentation. I guess I can hear some questions or objections or something like this, that morality tends to be thought of as kind of a prescriptive set of judgments. So how do you handle questions of value and judgment in your work in relation to moral argumentation, and the gap between what schools do and what they should do, as you were saying? And perhaps maybe you could then link that back up to these different scales that you're talking about.
Yeah, so this is one of the most difficult questions. And I find myself constantly interested in these moral questions. I actually used to be mostly interested in political questions. Maybe it's the influence of living in Hong Kong that's made me more interested in them as moral connections and seeing the relationship between what is moral and what is political. Because I think, for me, so on the one hand, you have these political topics and people have different views about them. And I'm starting to think about it more in education as an individual experience. And then I think moral argument becomes important because that's more about how an individual should treat and regard the world. But this is pretty difficult territory for sure. And I think this is something where people could say, there's some limitation or question my approach. I do think it's possible that living in Hong Kong has really influenced me here, because I'm feeling more and more a departure from a lot of my American colleagues who are puzzled, why am I interested in these things as moral things? And I guess one of the challenges is that when people think about morality, they think about individual person's experience, and the fact that everyone has a different experience, and we don't all sort of have the same, so there's a diversity of experiences, but we also don't have all the same sort of equalities and capacities and privileges and advantages in society. So here I'm thinking about, I'm often confronted with and having a dialogue with Martha Nussbaum's work, and I am attracted to liberal theory. I keep coming back to Immanuel Kant for whatever reason, and there's a lot of people that's a lot of thinkers I'm inspired by, but I often think about his exploration of freedom and autonomy. And there, I mean, he was really focused on some basic moral principles. So I keep coming back to these myself, and I think they're shared across a lot of philosophies, although they're not always articulated in the strong way that some liberals will articulate them. Basically treating everyone with respect, how to create a situation where everyone can be a person and develop in their own rights with their own actualization and realization. So those for me are just critical, really important things to think about. But they do take me back to a liberal tradition. And so the problem with the liberal tradition, And the reason why I'm confronted with the work of some liberals today, like John Rawls or Martha Nussbaum, is they have this, you get a sense when they start making a detailed argument that they're talking about a very specific circumstance, which is their own circumstance. So, and Martha Nussbaum struggled with this in discussing cosmopolitanism. So this connects, I think, to some critiques I've received of my book, Questioning Allegiance, which is that cosmopolitanism really assumes a certain framework where everyone's an individual and the whole world can come to a sort of universal perspective and come together and be on the same page. And I guess questions there are, is it possible for everyone to be on the same page and come to an agreement about the issues that really matter? Is that the right approach to take when there's really sort of deep conflicts across groups? And I think, so for Nussbaum, she actually went away and departed from a cosmopolitan view, saying at heart she's a liberal and she's more concerned with sort of what is important for liberal societies in terms of treating an individual. So in Asian societies, the individual is not always treated as such a significant player. And what was the second part of, I don't think I answered everything you asked. I think I got confused by myself.
Well, no, that's great. So you draw inspiration from Kant and from the liberal tradition in thinking about how you negotiate questions of value and judgment and moral argumentation. I mean, the second question was, how do you negotiate these things across scales? But you're also talking about the individual, the particular and the universal, the individual and the collective, and you're already sort of grappling that a little bit with your answer. And I don't know if you'd like to say anything more about that, but that's sort of where we were.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I keep coming back to, the individual versus the collective. And I think, on the other hand, when we see what's happened in the last year in the United Kingdom and the United States, I think this is a critical point to think through. Is there too much individualism in those countries, and is there not enough sense of the collective? So I'm increasingly interested in this relationship and how there's never really an absolute individual freedom, but that people always are sort of part of a collectivity. And people have this sense that Confucianism and other Asian traditions, there's no sense of self in those traditions, and that might be true for some senses of Buddhism. But actually, there's some interesting connections between Confucianism and liberalism. I mean, both of them support the sense that there's universal principles for treating each other, but then the place of relationships becomes more important in those contexts. So one thing I struggled with, and one thing I hoped to articulate in Questioning Allegiance, is that we learn to live together in these different, what I would call spheres, in every society, but that looks different in every society, and there's different tensions in each of those societies. So I wound up at the end thinking, actually, even the sense of self and being a good person is taught about slightly different in different contexts. And that's what actually drove me then to do the research and write the book on Beyond Virtue, is thinking through, actually, so many of these things are deeply felt at the individual level. And it's not just about how an individual treats people out there, but it's really about how each individual feels about the world around them. So this is probably going to be my main project for some time to come. And in part, it's probably just my own grappling with living in Hong Kong. And before I lived in Hong Kong, I lived in South Africa and Abu Dhabi, which are also very more communal societies, more communitarian societies, and just grappling with, okay, what are the deeply felt views about the world, which are moral views. So one thing, going back to moral philosophy, I think we all have these moral philosophies, but trying to actually put them out there and say, okay, what is the moral philosophy that we have? And let's really grapple with that, because that's going to be in tension with some other things in this contemporary world. And I guess that's why I'm driven to moral philosophy, although it's maybe seen as conservative in some contexts. My goal isn't to say we should do what Kant says or what Confucius says or follow a strict moral code. It's more about, we have these assumptions which are about personal morality. And if we can work these out and elaborate them and bring them to light, maybe we can help young people to really think about these things. I think probably in the US, there's a tendency to crystallize all these conversations as if they're about politics and identity. And that's one way to do it, but that's not the way I'm thinking about it from Hong Kong today.
So I also think that's actually great that you pointed to one of your other recent books, the Beyond Virtue, the politics of educating emotions, because when you're talking about the different tensions between, say, the local or the individual and the collective, and then also moral education and civic education, but a lot of times the emotions and the feelings they're not really as accounted for in those conversations. So for you, and you work through this in your book, what role do emotions play in that formation of, moral and civic education, and also in the formation of personal and political identity? And then I guess another way of asking this could be, how does actually attending to emotions present new insights for understanding those tensions, the difference, and the social conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that basically encapsulates the problems I've been thinking about in my head for some time now. So how did I get to emotions? I think I started thinking about the relationship of people to each other. I think I started my academic journey thinking about political issues around identity, and I started out thinking about Islamophobia. And so that's a feeling like phobia should be fear, but it can also be twisted around into a kind of love. So this is something that Sarah Ahmed taught me, and she's probably the main person who's really influenced me at this point. And also in Beyond Virtue, I really rely quite heavily on work done by Megan Bowler on how emotions are political and they're part of education. So a lot of the tradition of liberal philosophers of education, especially coming from the United Kingdom, there's this focus, really, there's still a focus there on autonomy. And so I did my master's degree in UK at Cambridge. So I think I was really influenced by that tradition when I first started doing research. So in that tradition, there's no place for feelings. So actually, for Immanuel Kant, the less feelings, the better. The issue there, and something that Megan Bowler points out, is there's really a neglect of the fact that there are emotions there, that a lot of the sort of traditional philosophers who say they're just focused on autonomy, they do have feelings. They might be stubborn, they might be inflexible, and they might just be afraid to talk about feelings. So patriotism is also a feeling. It's a feeling of love of country. And so you see this really clearly in the United States in the last decade, is that love of country becomes twisted around as implying a fear of certain others. So after 9/11, there was a lot of conservative educational policymakers who were saying that it's not compatible to love America and to not be hateful or negative or Islamophobic towards Muslims. And so I was concerned there was a big conflation there. And the media and education was then taking a role to encourage people to fear certain people. And you might say it's not fear, you might say it's actually hate or disgust. In any case, I think across societies, it's been my observation that people are given subtle messages in education and in society. Sometimes they're not subtle messages, but sometimes they are subtle, which basically says there's an in-group and there's an out-group. And we need to treat people differently based on whether they're in the in-group or out-group. and you need to demonstrate that, and it becomes a part of demonstrating your patriotism as well. And so something I've been struggling with when it comes to the focus on virtue ethics. So virtue ethics has become more popular in recent years as an approach to moral education in schools. There's an issue there that it doesn't really think about different identities in society and also different identities in the classroom. So once I started boiling down into what's happening in classrooms, I became really fascinated with how people have different roles and relations to each other, and how different sort of identity markers make a difference in the classroom. And this is where there's a deep level of emotional education taking place that people haven't really been thinking about. So now there's really a contemporary push to teach about emotions, to teach for well-being and resilience and mindfulness and these sorts of things. And there's an assumption that education hasn't really been looking at emotions before, or has been focusing on academic emotions, as some psychologists call them, like just being curious or open. People have always been concerned that young people shouldn't be angry or sad because then they're not going to learn well enough. But now there's a concern that learning about emotions also helps us play a positive role in society. So in that context, I also became interested in how does that play out in an actual classroom situation? So what I want to argue is we don't normally have a curriculum around emotion. So similar to civic education, there's not a curriculum there, but if you look beneath the surface, there are things happening. So gratitude's very hot topic now. Young people definitely learn at school how to have gratitude. They learn to thank guests in the class, to thank people. So that's part of an education for gratitude. Then if you look at the next level down within a classroom sort of micro environment, people are also taught different lessons. And so this is an argument that I would make. If you survey different groups, if you survey men and women about how important gratitude is, so they did this research in the UK, they found that women think gratitude is more important than men do. Similarly, Christians tend to hold gratitude in higher regard than some other groups. So what I want to argue here is it's not like this natural biological feature of women or Christians that they're just naturally grateful. They're learning it. And I think what happens in schools is people have unconscious bias. So if a little boy in my class says thank you and they're very sarcastic about it, I might think, okay, that's fine. You know, he doesn't have to be thankful. If the little girl seems sarcastic, I might not be as nice to her. And then she might learn from that lesson. She might learn, oh, I have to really show my sort of deep, undying gratitude in order for my teacher to like me. So I want to argue that those things happen to people all the time, and that it happens differently here in Hong Kong compared to America, but it does happen in both places. And so I'm still exploring this issue. I loved writing the book Beyond Virtue and learning about it. And I'm still thinking about it all the time here in Hong Kong because Hong Kong's influenced by such a different tradition than the United States. So there's a lot of interesting things there, and I'm still exploring them. I have a new project actually with a group of colleagues at my university. We're calling it VIEW, V-I-E-W, VIEW Lab, Virtues in Education, East meets West. And so like I said before, some people think virtues is a very conservative idea, but we're not interested in just promoting virtues per se. We're not just interested in saying young people have to learn how to have gratitude and humility and how to be open-minded. That's not our goal. Our goal is to think through what does this have to do with human relations and connections and with our perception of what a community should be like, which definitely looks different in Hong Kong and Confucian heritage context versus very strictly liberal contexts like US and UK.